What if one loaf cost more than your entire country had in cash last year? Sounds impossible, but it happened. That was Germany in 1923. Between the two world wars, Germany experienced a debt crisis that snapped into hyperinflation. In this video, you'll see exactly how it happened and the hard, deliberate steps that finally stabilized the system. Let's begin. When the war started in July 1914, the German mark was still backed by gold. That link gave the currency credibility because its value was based on something real. Anyone could exchange a paper note for a fixed amount of gold. But the system came under strain almost immediately. In 1914, war didn't just mobilize armies, it triggered uncertainty and a flight from paper money. And people rushed to exchange notes for gold. Within weeks, gold prices jumped and the Reichsbank lost about a tenth of its gold reserves. In August 1914, Germany suspended gold convertibility to stop the drain on reserves and keep money circulating. Once that link was cut, the mark lost its anchor, and the government could print beyond its gold. As the war dragged on, costs exploded. Government spending rose to nearly 2.5 times its pre-war level. To cover it, Berlin had three options: raise taxes, borrow abroad, or borrow from its own citizens. Officials expected a quick victory and feared that higher taxes would suggest otherwise. And foreign lenders avoided a country cut off from global markets. That left one path: domestic borrowing. War bonds became the preferred solution. Citizens lent their savings to the state, expecting repayment with interest once the war was won. At first, financing came mainly through bonds, but as prices rose and confidence faded, citizens stopped subscribing. With taxes and borrowing falling short, the government turned to the Reichsbank, which began creating new marks to buy its short-term debt, effectively printing money to pay the bills. With private savings exhausted, the central bank became the primary lender, which printed money to fund for everything. What began as a temporary wartime measure had become permanent. Germany's military defeat in November 1918 plunged the nation into chaos, setting the stage for the next wave of inflation. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II stepped down from the throne, and the German Revolution gave rise to the fragile Weimar Republic. But this new democracy was born into crisis. Allied blockades starved the country of food and fuel well into mid-1919, a deliberate pressure to force Berlin's hand at the peace table. Violence flared in the streets as communists, nationalists, and veterans groups fought for power. Amid the panic, capital fled abroad, and the mark lost nearly a third of its value against the dollar within months. The new social democratic government kept using the same tools as during the war. Instead of raising taxes, they paid for recovery, demobilization, and social programs by borrowing from the Reichsbank and expanding the money supply. They feared that without government spending, unemployment and unrest could tear the young republic apart. Then came the Treaty of Versailles, signed June 28, 1919. The treaty stripped Germany of around 13% of its territory, nearly half its iron output, a sixth of its coal. Its army was capped at 100,000 men, heavy weapons were banned, and vast reparations were imposed to compensate the Allies, along with all its overseas colonies. The shock triggered strikes and protests. Foreign investors pulled back, fearing default. Tax revenues plunged further, while the government's printing presses filled the gap. Reparations were imposed, though the final sum was not fixed until 1921. German debtors with foreign obligations saw their costs explode. The falling mark briefly helped the economy. German goods became cheaper abroad, exports jumped, factories stayed busy, and profits improved. It created a short period of stability, but it was only the illusion of recovery, built on a weakening currency. Political cost was already immense. The policies that had preserved social peace also deepened class divisions and destroyed savings. The Kapp Putsch in March 1920, a brief right-wing coup attempt led by army officers, revealed how uncertain loyalty to the new republic still was. Repeated communist uprisings soon followed, showing a nation at war with itself. And yet, the Reichsbank kept credit loose. Then came May 1921, the London Ultimatum. The Allies, impatient with delay, demanded full acceptance of the reparation schedule, 132 billion gold marks. With annual payments in gold, foreign exchange, coal, timber, and manufactured goods. The scale and structure of these obligations changed Germany's financial position immediately. Until the end of the war, almost all of Germany's debt had been domestic, taken from its own citizens in paper marks. But after the war, Germany's situation shifted. The Treaty of Versailles required an interim transfer of 20 billion marks, paid in gold and real assets. This was Germany's first major block of external hard currency obligations. Between 1919 and 1921, domestic debt rapidly lost weight as inflation rose, and a brief export recovery brought in some foreign income. The London Ultimatum changed that. Almost overnight, Germany's external debt surged to nearly 350% of national output, with annual payments stretching into the early 1920s. As hyperinflation approached, Germany was already carrying a foreign currency debt burden heavier than in any hyperinflation crisis that followed. And foreign debt cannot be inflated away. As the mark weakened, these external debts became more expensive to service. Every step down in the exchange rate raised the real cost of repayment. Germany had only a few workable choices. Cut spending? Politically suicidal, when unemployment relief and food support kept people from revolt. Raise taxes? The population was already impoverished and overtaxed. Borrow abroad? International credit had dried up, and gold reserves could not even cover the first payment. Default? France made clear that default would mean the invasion of the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart. Printing became the only path left. With foreign lenders unwilling to buy Reich debt and reparations draining gold abroad, the press became the state's last financier. The political cost was equally sharp. In August 1921, Finance Minister Matthias Erzberger, architect of Germany's fiscal reforms and advocate of treaty compliance, was assassinated by ultranationalists. His death marked the collapse of moderate politics and the deepening of public distrust. By early 1922, Germany's fragile calm was thinning. But hopes of relief vanished when France refused further reviews of Germany's capacity to pay. Britain had urged leniency, but France, determined to enforce full reparations, shut the door on compromise. The chance for renegotiation disappeared. Nationalist anger over reparations reached a breaking point. Days later, on June 24th, Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau was assassinated by right-wing extremists. He was one of the few German leaders the Allies trusted, and his murder ended hopes for a negotiated settlement. The immediate result was a collapse in confidence. Capital ran for the exits. Over half of all foreign-owned deposits fled German banks within months. Wealthy Germans followed, moving fortunes abroad in fear of confiscatory taxes and rising unrest. People rushed to exchange paper for anything tangible. First diamonds, art, and real estate, Then, as panic widens, pianos, soap, even hairpins, shelves cleared in a frenzy of liquidation. This created a liquidity crisis. The government kept spending, but it didn't have the money. So the Reichsbank stepped in, which basically meant creating new marks whenever the government needed them. This flow here is what we call debt monetization. Printing was judged a necessary evil, the only way to prevent a cash shortage. Every mark printed to ease payments only weakened the next one. Germany's great industrial firms briefly profited from the chaos. A cheap mark made exports soar, bringing in scarce foreign exchange and keeping employment just high enough to blunt leftist unrest. But real profits evaporated quickly as inflation devoured wages and working capital. By December 1922, the mark had cratered to 8,000 per US dollar. The currency no longer worked as money. Lifetimes of savings were erased, and with them, the last fragile threads of public faith in the state. By 1923, Germany's inflationary spiral turned into a full economic collapse. A small delay in timber and coal deliveries gave France and Belgium their excuse. On January 11, 1923, 60,000 troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's main industrial region and source of reparations goods. Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno responded with defiance. He called for passive resistance. Workers in the occupied zone stopped production. Trains and factories shut down. The government promised to pay the strikers and keep businesses alive. With taxes collapsing and no foreign credit, Berlin had only one option left: to print money. But the more money it printed, the less it was worth. Prices rose faster, and people spent money even quickly, trying to buy goods before prices changed again. Even though billions of notes were printed, there still wasn't enough cash. The Ruhr occupation also cut off a quarter of Germany's industry and most of its exports. Abroad, Britain and the United States criticized France for the invasion, but nothing changed. Germany remained isolated, politically humiliated and economically strangled. What happened next was staggering. In 16 months, the mark went from roughly hundreds per US dollar to trillions per dollar. By late 1923, all of Germany's 1913 money could barely buy one loaf of bread. Insurance and pensions became worthless. Savings disappeared. Families sold everything they owned: jewelry, furniture, even clothes, just to buy food. Cities saw riots, theft, and looting as hunger spread and faith in government vanished. By August, the cost of resistance had become unbearable. The chaos spilled into politics. On November 8th, Adolf Hitler tried to overthrow the government in Munich, the beer hall putsch. The coup failed, but his trial gave him national attention and turned anger over Versailles into a rallying cry. Germany was in constant crisis. President Ebert repeatedly used special powers to push decisions through as the country lurched from one crisis to the next. Germany's escape from hyperinflation in late 1923 and 1924 was not a miracle. It was a deliberate four-part repair job, each step designed to restore the one thing money cannot live without: trust. First, under the London Ultimatum, Germany's debt service was crushing. Germany owed 132 billion gold marks in reparations. 50 billion came with fixed quarterly payments, non-negotiable, due immediately. The remaining 82 billion could be demanded anytime the Allies judged Germany able to pay. Those scheduled payments alone absorbed nearly a third of government revenue, a crushing load for an economy already shattered by war. Germany wasn't the only country buried in war debt. The Allies owed the United States more than $10 billion, and Washington wanted its money back. But the Allies could repay America only if Germany repaid them. So when everything stalled, the United States stepped in to break the impasse and get German payments moving again. An Allied committee led by an American banker designed a plan to end the Ruhr crisis and restart payments without wrecking recovery. The result was the Dawes Plan of 1924. It set a fixed, predictable schedule, cutting annual payments to about 1% of national income in the early years. The Ruhr was evacuated, and a $200 million foreign loan brought fresh capital. For the first time, reparations looked payable, shifting them from an impossible burden to a manageable obligation. By 1923, Germany's paper mark had lost its function as money. The government then introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark. It was backed by claims on German land and industrial assets. The Rentenmark was fixed at 4.2 to the US dollar. Within weeks, prices stabilized. The most important change was not the introduction of a new currency, but the limits placed on how much of it could exist. The Rentenbank was allowed to issue only a very small amount of currency, and the amount of credit it could extend was capped in advance. These limits worked partly because the financial system had already shrunk. By late 1923, inflation had destroyed the real value of the existing money supply. In practical terms, there was now so little effective currency in circulation that it could be fully backed by reserves. The system became simpler, cleaner, and easier to understand. Confidence didn't return because people trusted promises. It returned because the numbers finally made sense. Monetary discipline alone was not enough. The government also had to stop running deficits. Taxes were indexed to inflation, so revenue could no longer collapse in real terms as prices rose. At the same time, emergency taxes were introduced, and spending was cut aggressively. Subsidies were ended. Public sector wages were reduced. Employment was cut. These measures were deeply unpopular, but after years of chaos, the public was willing to accept them. As confidence in the currency returned, Germans began converting foreign currency back into marks. At the same time, the Dawes Plan brought in fresh US loans, boosting Germany's reserves. That gave Germany the foreign currency it needed to pay overseas debts and keep imports flowing. And because those bills were covered without printing more marks, the currency could hold its value. For a while, the system worked. By late 1924, the emergency was over, and Germany entered what came to be called the Golden Twenties. Yet beneath the surface, this new prosperity rested on borrowed dollars, a foundation that would one day be tested again.